Hi, and welcome to Art Lab, a podcast dedicated to conversations on visual culture, with me, Kamayani. On today's episode, we have with us Rintu Thomas and Sushmit Ghosh, whose debut feature, Writing with Fire, won the Special Jury Award, Impact for Change, and the Audience Award at the Sundance Film Festival 2021 in the World Cinema Documentary category. The film is about the journalists of Khabar Lahariya, a rural feminist media initiative run by women largely from oppressed castes. Though it hasn't been released yet, I thought it'd be a good moment to talk with its directors about non-fiction film practice, its current context in South Asia, especially India, as well as the way in which it is being received and platformed within the international documentary circuit. Let me first introduce you to Rintu and Sushmit. Graduates of the Master's Program at AJK Mass Communication Research Center, or MCRC, at Jamia Millia Islamia, they co-founded a production company with a focus on social justice called Black Ticket Films in 2009, putting out, in their words, a slate of films that are being used as advocacy, impact, and educational tools by institutions across the world. Their work has been supported by international organizations, including the Sundance Institute, International Documentary Film Festival, Amsterdam, the Tribeca Institute, and the Finnish Film Institute, among many others. They won the National Award for Best Film on the Environment in 2013 for their short documentary, Timbuktu, about an agricultural collective in Andhra Pradesh started by activists in the 1980s. You can view all their films on Black Ticket Films' website. On today's episode, we discuss the political economy of documentary filmmaking, its practitioners' love-hate relationship with the state. I think every government media organization in India has been name-checked in this episode. The influence and legacy of humanism in non-fiction film, and whether its future in South Asia lies on TikTok-type formats. Before we continue, I'd like to let our listeners know how to access the material accompanying our conversation. To view the images and other material being referenced and discussed in the episode, click on the link in the show notes to access the guide. You can also find the link to the guide for each episode in our Instagram captions and tweets. Hi, and welcome to Art Lab, Rintu and Sushmit. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Kamayani. It's very exciting to be talking to you like this.
Yeah, I'm quite thrilled that you guys agreed to be on the show. I've always been curious, like a lot of people, I'm sure, who've cinephiles who've sort of grown up, reading about and hearing about the festival circuit. What was it like being at Sundance, even if virtually? I know you guys were there virtually because of the pandemic. And what was it like finding out that you'd won the Audience Award and Special Jury Prize? It's a huge moment, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's just. I think both of us have grown up watching films that have come out of Sundance. Some of our favorite filmmakers have started their journey over there, so it felt special to have Writing with Fire playing at Sundance, albeit virtually. But I think what blew our heads was that, I mean, the festival director called us up like at 1 a.m. and was just like, "You guys have won the jury award." We were like, "What? Really?" It's like, yeah. This is great, but just keep it on the loops because the announcements are going to happen in 48 hours. But this is great. You need to make a little video. So we made the video and sent it through to them. And then 12 hours later, she calls us up again. This news because you've also won the Audience Award, and that's where it really sort of like that was special because even she said that winning the jury award is of course a recognition for the film and from your peers, but the Audience Award is of course special. And this year what happened was that because the festival was virtual, Sundance opened up the films that it had in its slate pan America. So instead of actually physically having to go to Park City, you could be sitting anywhere in the US and watching the film. So there was a diverse audience that watched it, and I think like pretty much most films that played at Sundance this year went full house. We went full house for both screenings, so we had about 10,000 folks watching the film, and from that to get the audience award was super special. So we were absolutely over the moon. It's just such an honor and such a privilege.
Also, because what does it really mean, the stage. and the scale of that stage, because non-fiction filmmaking is such a lonely enterprise. You're pretty much doing everything on your own, and we'd been doing that for this particular film for 5 long years. And in the middle came the pandemic, which threw so many uncertainties vis-a-vis everything, festivals and building your audience and everything. So, for an entirely Indian film made by Indian directors, produced by an Indian crew, to have that kind of stage, I mean, awards apart, but just that stage for the story to find its first audience was so satisfying. And I think it also opens up many gates for a lot of other things that will follow, a lot of other stories that are in the making. I think that is also a significant thing to for us, really.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I'm interested in, taking off, from your specific win, is that also I'm interested in how you view the interest in Indian or South Asian films or films from the global South within the, international exhibitionary complex, which, one might call the film festival circuit, um, in regular parlance, and particularly how it pertains to non-fiction cinema. In the past few years, we're seeing more attention on films that come out of our part of the world. Off the top of my head, I can think of films like Saving Face, An Insignificant Man, or Naeem Mohammed's work. That has certain implications, political, economic, and infrastructural, for movie making and documentary filmmaking, um, in India, let's say. So what do you think of that? How do you conceive of that? How do you view that sort of um, phenomenon? And I think that it's an answer that is an important one for people to hear, because you guys are big winners, but also, like, therefore in a position to speak about this kind of shift, infrastructural shift. And then, there are political reasons for this. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at also.
It is a sort of like, I mean, the canvas is massive. Like, your question is really interesting. So let me just, if you look at sort of like what's been happening over the past few years, this bigger question about who tells whose stories, that is essentially gripped like the global nonfiction community, so to speak. This larger debate of, do white folks get to tell stories about black lives that matter, or who controls the narrative? So, in India as well, we've had like so many documentaries, nonfiction projects, where you have like American crews or British crews come in and tell stories that are essentially quintessentially Indian. But, I think over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, these conversations have sort of like taken precedence, and that in itself has essentially informed how these stories are now being told, and really sort of the gatekeepers have in a sense shifted. If you look at, from just an industry point of view globally, like, more and more of these positions are now being manned by people of color, women of color, and that essentially is allowing for, these pathways to open, where filmmakers from, the global South are able to sort of tap into the resources required to essentially tell stories that are important to us, and tell it in a way that comes from the heart, is an absolutely sort of like quintessential local story, but has global relevance as well. It also sort of goes back to the fact, this conversation that we were having last time about, in India specifically, there is this, institutional support for documentaries is almost missing. I mean, it would be safe to say there is nothing over here for a documentary filmmaker who's sort of like, trying to break into the industry, who wants to sort of work on a project for, say, 2 or 3 years. How do you do it? You need to do these side gigs, and it's essentially this gig economy that you need to sort of like, survive, and then put in whatever you're saving into sort of your dream project, right? And you can only in a sense go that far with that. And so for the films that have come out of India over the course of the last, I would say, 7-8 years, if you look at these documentaries, these are films that have been supported by really the institutions that bring a lot of credibility, institutions that bring a lot of strength, institutions that strengthen your own canvas of storytelling, from, say, the Sundance to the IDFAs of the world to, say, commissioning editors with channels who are now supporting stories from the global south. And India, of course, has always been a point of interest because I don't think we're a country, we're literally a continent. I mean,
Yeah, I mean the sheer number of talented people, the sheer volume of talent, that's for sure.
I mean, the range of stories that we have, and
Mm.
just, I mean, if you go to sort of like storytelling culture also in India changes. I mean, you just need to like travel 100 kilometers, food, language, oral traditions, everything sort of like,
Yeah.
you see a big. So there's just such a repository of sort of storytellers over here. And I think the world is, I wouldn't say discovering, but I would say has found ways in which to support folks coming from here telling our stories. So yeah.
So there's two things that I kind of want to respond to, and I think that first of all, like what you said about the sort of white gaze that has dominated obviously the international filmmaking complex is sort of receding in a sense, or being challenged, let's say. That's one kind of way of looking at it. And there's a kind of decolonization of documentary practice that's maybe happening, but the money is still being routed through power centers in the global north, right? Like I'm thinking of a documentary like, to your point, like, period end of sentence, right? Although directed by an American, it was co-produced by an Indian team led by Guneet Monga, which was very involved on ground, as I understand from reading interviews, in putting the film together. And in that sense, there were many local eyes that were part of the filmmaking assemblage, which was widely critiqued within the subcontinent, which won an Oscar, which was lauded worldwide, and it was a film that attracted a lot of very valid criticisms about representation. But at the same time, when we talk about diversity and we talk about inclusion, that is also determined entirely by a kind of imperialist corporate aesthetic and political logic, right? Like what kinds of stories are also acceptable to for festivals in the global north. I mean, not always, but that's definitely a part of it, right? Like when you have the power centers are still located in, let's say, the UK, the US, sort of Anglo-American contexts. So that's always a sort of worry as well, like what kinds of representations even by local filmmakers are validated or appreciated. And the other thing is, I think, what you talked about, which I think is a really important point, about the dwindling of already poor resources dedicated to filmmaking, film practice, and documentary film practice in particular. The traditional source of financing for independent documentaries in India has been the state, whether it's PSBT or Public Service Broadcasting Trust, or Films Division, or NFDC. And last year, I think there was a restructuring with the National Film Archives of India and Films Division merging into NFDC, National Film Development Corporation of India, for those who don't know. So that, I think, is very interesting, because it's almost like these things are not coincidental, right? There's a shrinking of state support and a kind of pumping of international money into because of that lack, you know. So that is not, you can't decouple those. And I think that is a very interesting point you made about this kind of reduction of resources. Through the 2010s, people have studied the relationship between the film festival circuit as part of a global culture industry configured by the West, quote unquote, financial systems and ideological values, and then the link to the neoliberal documentary form, which is basically the representation of reality, let's say, in the global South that's palatable to this West. And you are part of a generation that is navigating that shift, which I think is also really interesting. And what you said about the gig economy logic, I mean, I think that's true of all practitioners, right? Like, I feel like I never want to see the words SEO, content writing, ever again. Like, I will literally bodily reject that phrase. Like, we're all hustling and we're all doing these great creative projects on the side.
Yeah, and we've always been on, like, in terms of just wanting to tell our story, it's always been thin ice, right? You want to do five other things so that you can just fund this one thing that you truly believe in, but nobody else does. And I think earlier, very early on, when we had just started Black Ticket Films, and we were just contemplating or strategizing on how do we get projects. And this is way back in 2009, 2010, where social media, we're just transitioning from Orkut to Facebook, and everything is organic. So you're building your audience, brick and mortar.
Showing our age,
And
really showing our
yeah.
age, all of us. Or good.
And we realized that, what is institutional support, what are the avenues. It's either PSBT, films division. It's all these other small grants within these organizations, and the DVAP.
Oh, right, right. The Directorate of Advertising and Visual Publicity.
The DAVP empanelment, which meant that you had to be a vendor and get registered, etc. So we said, okay, let's try and like develop our own things, which nobody's going to really fund at the moment, but also let's try and tap into what exists. So we actually applied to DD Urdu
Oh,
right in the
wow.
beginning.
Amazing.
We put in a proposal. It was very interesting. We had an
Bold
open call.
moves. Yeah.
on revolutionary Muslim women throughout Indian history, and it was just like a portrait series of 10 episodes, which
It was an open call, and we sort of like boiled down to like a 10, 11 episode piece on
yes,
Muslim women who'd sort of like changed. Yeah.
yeah, and it had an entry fee, so you had to pay 12,000 rupees or 20.
No, we ended up. So, oh yeah, this is the story. So
Very crazy
we
story.
didn't have
Yeah.
money in our bank.
Wait,
then.
let me get this right. You guys had to pay DD.
Yeah, you
to
had to
apply.
pay. So there was an application
Yeah.
fees of 25,000,
Yes.
and we borrowed 12,500 each from our parents.
Yeah.
And it was made a demand draft, and then
Yeah.
so I mean, this whole conversation about how the power centers lie in the West, or the Anglo-Saxon. Actually, the power centers actually lie in India as well.
No, for sure.
There are
For sure.
yeah.
Not to sort
If you
of.
look
Yeah.
at the industry itself, there is nothing stopping, say, an A-list Bollywood producer from coming in and investing in indie fiction or indie non-fiction.
Yeah.
In fact, even with Writing with Fire, we had approached producers in India along our journey to sort of come on board, and we didn't find that interest. And so obviously when we went sort of like pitching the film globally, and that's where people woke up to the story. And now, of course, everyone's saying, wow, like, why didn't you come to us? And we're like, but we did, and you weren't interested. So what do we make of that? So this debate about how, and it's specifically in nonfiction, because there's literally nothing available. I think interestingly, like over the course of the last few years, institutions like BGDM, Brown Girl Doc Mafia, they were filmmakers, they are artists who came together and really challenged the system, and they have rewritten the rules of the game. Like BGDM has contested so many sort of like pieces that are being put out by these powerful OTT networks, challenging, who's the producer and why is this executive producer, your choice of, how did you actually get this story made? What was your process? That was really wrong. So, these are not just cultural conversations, but these are conversations that filmmakers are now having with, the guard, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it's happening. I think that it's really heartening to see that. This whole debate of like how much should we step out of like these boundaries that have been drawn for us and it's scary to do that, especially when you're working in a genre that is such a lonely practice.
Yeah.
So do you want to stick your neck out? But so many folks are doing that, and just but the act of doing that itself has led to so many conversations that are leading to change. It's going to take time, but I think that, it's happening, and the rules are being rewritten. I don't know how that's going to affect folks like you and me, but I do believe that it is going to sort of change a lot of things. And I think fundamentally, one of the fundamental reasons why now there is this revived interest um, in storytelling from the South by storytellers from the South is exactly that. That filmmakers in the West have woken up to this piece about why should white men be telling our stories, and who are these people who actually sort of like throw a dollar at us and expect sort of like a certain kind of narrative that
Mm.
satisfies their sort of like sense of colonial guilt or whatever it is that you want to
Mm.
call it.
Mm.
So
And I also think that those hierarchies are replicated even within a particular media culture, right? Like, let's say India or South Asia. I mean, we are basically dominated, we are a bourgeois, Savarna dominated industry, culture sector, all of us, for instance. And the Savarna gaze is in many ways analogous to the white gaze. And returning to our discussion of the international political economy of culture, like who in the global south gets to tell stories, like even within the global south there are all these stratifications. Who in the global south gets to represent their reality, which is usually problematically conceived of or sort of framed in terms of the national, for the global market. Like in India, middle to upper class folk from upper castes are the ones who'll even be resourced enough to make it to these festivals. But I just want to kind of go back to your filmography in general. I want to take a look at your work through Black Ticket Films. It seems like there's been a mix of commissioned work that you guys spoke about, and films that seem to be of your part of your own kind of passion, like Kings of Horror, which was about the Ramsay brothers, movies from the 80s, and of course Writing with Fire about Khabar Lahariya. How do you balance your personal political and aesthetic commitments across projects where you have varying levels of control over the content?
Very early on, we as we were pitching ourselves to different organizations, and this was a time when people didn't have communication budgets allocated for films or any kind of visual material. We were actually creating pitch decks and approaching organizations saying, you do this incredible work, you need to look at how you can use the visual medium to talk back to your funders or audiences or just people to talk about your work, etc. And that's how we built our portfolio, really. And while that was happening, we always made sure that there was time and money saved to do our own thing. And we looked at it as two separate things at that time. And Delhi and Timbuktu and Notes
Yeah.
from a Beautiful City,
Mm.
these are films that emerged out of that process. But I think we've been very fortunate that our commissioned work has more or less, I'd say 9 out of 10 times hit the interest points that we have.
Mhm.
So had the incredible good fortune to work with projects that are talking about working with adolescent girls and health and public health in rural India, where women who have taken charge to change things for themselves and their communities, and sustainable livelihoods, resilience of local communities through their culture of food. So there was always this similarity in
Mm.
interests. So it either we went looking for it or
Mm.
they came looking for us. Eventually, as the company was growing and the teams were growing, we were just like, this is exactly what I want to do. So, and I'm getting paid to do this. Was really the overarching joy of it. But there have been projects that were pitched to us where the lens didn't feel right,
Mm.
or the the tonality with which the story was being conceived was didn't feel right. And we've always had those conversations right on the beginning, where we have said, this is how we would like to see, because there is a great deal of power that we have as storytellers, as filmmakers, and we are aware of the power that rests within us. So we want to use that responsibly. And those are very open conversations that we've had with all the folks that were commissioning projects to us. And sometimes those conversations have not really taken a shape or direction that we would have liked, and one has said no to those
Mm.
projects. And even within work that we've done, there have been so many times where you're interviewing somebody, and this could be a young girl who's just fought off child marriage, or a mother who's lost her daughter to because there's no public health in Majuli in Assam,
Mm.
and the climate has actually been around saying, let's ask them this. And where we've stepped in and said no, because what we're trying to get at is not, scratching raw wounds. So it's really these negotiations, it's language, it's how you put across your questions, where we've actively negotiated. And that is a part of our work ethic at
Hmm.
BTF. And every person who's worked with us, every person in our team across the past 10, 11 years, that's the culture that we really hold very close to our hearts. So wherever our people, and I call them our people, have gone and now working in different aspects of the industry, we know that this is something that they're carrying. That's what brought us together, and that's what we're actually taking to every project that we go.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, that's one of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind, even when looking at a film like Writing with Fire, which I haven't, of course, had the chance to see yet, and so can't comment specifically on, or other films that the shorter documentaries that you made in the past. I'm thinking of like Notes from a Beautiful City, for example, about the communities that were displaced during the 2010 Commonwealth Games held in Delhi. Where there is a kind of danger of exploiting the subject, and because already the gaze is so determined by a subject position that is not symmetrical with the person being interviewed, right? So they're much more vulnerable. And these debates are very old in documentary film practice. From, Grierson onwards, these conversations have been had. This is not new. But like imagine 120 years later, we're still talking about this within, the discourse of cinema. So, yeah, I mean, and I think that that's something that I also was curious about, the ethic of engaging with other people, because documentary film practice is often it's about other people, right? And so it's you can't decouple it even aesthetically from those questions of interpersonal relationships and sort of relational power play, which you may be able to do in fiction film, because fiction shows you what's probable or possible given the specific set of conditions in the world, not what is, to put it really crudely. And I was also actually looking at films like Notes on a Beautiful City, and even Zara, Queen of the Desert, which is a kind of wildlife documentary, and also like the latest Only for 18 and Above, which seems to be like about sort of encouraging people to vote or like participate in elections and democracy. So the postcards to me section of Black Ticket Films, I felt like it reminded me of the films division shots of your, there is that kind of quality, a lot of the thematic, and even some of the formal kind of configurations are sort of reminiscent of that ilk of films. How do you locate your practice within the broader history of the Indian documentary, and even like, or even the contemporary currents? How do you position yourself in that, force field of practices that constitute documentary or non-fiction film in India?
One of the core reasons why we essentially started Black Ticket Films was, how do you create non-fiction content that engages the Indian viewer? Because we were coming off a time where we didn't have DSLRs yet that made the visual image look a certain way, where you had these full frame cameras that can play with depth in a manner that can
Mm.
make your visuals look gorgeous. So you had to sort of be shooting with your PDs or your Z1s, and the images, in a sense, had a consistently flat quality. So how do you sort of break away from form and
Hmm.
sort of redesign stories in a way that can engage an audience? So I remember one of our first indies was this film called In Search of My Home, which was about two families, one an Afghan family and a Burmese family, a Myanmarese family, where basically they were living in Delhi as
Hmm.
invisible citizens. And the challenge that we had was, formalistically, like, we could only do interviews and nothing else. So we decided to sort of like break away from that. And one story was shot entirely as stop motion photographs. So you had scenes playing out, but it's, you see the movement play out as stop motion pieces. And we used text and we, painted on glass, and stuff like that happened. And we put this film out, and this was our first film where we leveraged Facebook And on World Refugee Day, this film played in across 20 countries. One of the families had been denied the UN refugee certification, and this film created so much noise in Delhi that the UNHCR eventually had to revoke its own stance and issue a refugee certificate to the Myanmarese family. So I don't know how to locate this in sort of Indian nonfiction practice, because I think we have so much more to do before we can actually sort of like find this space, because we have the doyens of, like, I mean, Anand Patwardhan is someone whose work who's um, everyone's grown up to, so these are, like, the godfathers who we look up to. And so I don't know if we've actually actively ever talked about where do we see us in India, but it's always been about how do we tell this story, how does one approach it, and does it make sense?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that I'm hearing you also talk about your early films and the sort of stylistic decisions you made, this kind of all these sort of formal choices with regard to, say, the lens and the kind of camera. I mean, especially, like, I'm thinking also of Notes on a Beautiful City. Like, it seemed like more wide angle shots as well, of stills, right? And
Yeah.
so this sense of, like, panorama in a way, where, in communities that are actually completely invisible, so you kind of flip that optical logic, right, on its head. So there are obviously, like, these decisions you're making. I'm actually thinking of, I wrote a very critical piece on Anand Patwardhan. So in Artforum, basically, I talked about how, like, his film, like Reason, there's a particular strain of political documentary that's OTOs at this point. When he made Ram Ke Naam in 92 or 93, in the early 90s,
Mm.
those talking heads of young men saying, spewing this garbage was provocative and scary.
Hmm.
And now it's banal. Like,
Hmm.
people, we have a terrorist in parliament who'll say this. So that's also kind of, and there are aesthetic stakes here. I mean, and there are real, very real ethical stakes here. So I think that when we talk about the aesthetics of impact, that shift is very important to talk about. People like Anand Patwardhan, important as they are, of course, they sort of emerge at a particular moment in post-emergency India, where there's a very different media sphere, a very different technological, environment. So I think that that's something I'm really interested in also, hearing from you as we maybe advance through the interview. What is this aesthetics of impact? Because that, I think, is a more interesting formulation to think about. There are very real political and material consequences. There are ethical consequences, and they all are inherent in the form and style of the film. Like, as we were just discussing, they cannot be delinked. So
Hmm.
and I'm also thinking of a film like Kings of Horror. Kings of Horror is a film that it's a short documentary about this sort of cinematic culture of the 1980s, and the kind of social worlds and social imaginaries that sort of were part of the viewing experience of these sort of B grade horror films. The way in which you chose to shoot the film, the Ramsay brothers did not want to appear on camera. You made that clear in the film. And B, you have all these contemporary filmmakers who are now big shots like Sriram Raghavan, Anurag Kashyap, Ashim Ahluwalia, legitimizing that nostalgia and talking about their own boyhood love affair with these seedy 80s films. So the talking heads and also the graphic interventions that you guys use, the illustrations. I want to talk to you guys about that, because I know that you discussed how there was a certain kind. These were choices that you also had to make because of the limitations of what was available to you materially, right? And I want to talk a little bit about that. So how do your film aesthetics get determined by that, by the lack?
पता ही नहीं था ये फिल्म बनाने के लिए जैसे बनाया.
I think like a lot of projects of the heart, we started talking about it when we were in college, and we shared the love for Ramsay ki ye dekhi hai, and most of viewing was clandestine as we were growing up, kind of things. And we'd always talked about in our random conversation, oh, we should explore this. India has a very bad culture of like not archiving its fascinating past. So we should, and we would never get to it till after Timbuktu. We saw this call out from PSBT saying, call for proposals, and Sushmit said, I think we should put Ramsay wali film ka proposal, and I thought PSBT is never going to fund anything like that. Why do you even want to waste your
And
time
I was
doing
just
that?
like, hum kaun sa ye bana rahe? We've been sitting on it for like 6 years
So he said
now.
we needed a push. He said, I'm just going to do it. And he wrote the proposal in like a day and sent it in. And lo and behold, they wrote back saying we'd be interested. And our lens at that time was, who are these people? Fans know their biography, which is fascinating. But more importantly, what were they trying to do with this kind of cinema? How did they thrive? And what does that tell us about our film watching and film producing culture? So that was the larger question we were exploring. And then BSBT told us what the budget was.
Yeah, I mean, then we realized that we basically had literally
That
we had
was
to
the
put
real
out.
moment of horror.
Ironically, like the budget had gone down from many years ago when we'd done Timbuktu with PSBT. Incidentally, like we were getting offered less, and in all their graciousness, PSBT said, "From this commission of filmmakers, you've actually got the most." And we were like, "But this doesn't even touch 4 lakhs. Like, how am I supposed to get a team together, let alone travel to Bombay, stay in Bombay, and I mean, you're trying to sort of line up an interview with Anurag Kashyap, and you have no idea whether he's going to give you time or not." And we discovered how notorious the film industry can be, because you land up there, but you got to sort of wait like 3 days before. So through friends and friends of friends, we were able to reach out to these folks, and they were super. They were just like, let's do this. And we discovered why. Because of their love for the Ramsays. I mean, they are big fans of the work of the Ramsays. So I think that is what made making this film so special, because we knew very early on that this was going to be a joyous ode to the Ramsay brothers, whether they decide to come on camera or not. How we sort of designed the first cut was exactly what you're talking about. It was a super political cut, because the film talked about themes of censorship, about politics, about, again, who gets to tell whose stories, and how, if you're not a part of a clique, then you're the economic sort of out of the economics of what Bollywood essentially is all about. How do you beat the system? And how modern day sort of authors, so to speak, actually have followed the Ramsay model to sort of like, build on they've built on their legacy, but the legacy has never been recognized. And I mean, this is something that we've always talked about. Like, sort of like, when I think about it, like I always go back to the cinematographers like Shubrata Mitra, who shot all of Ray's films, who basically gave us the concept of bounce light. Archiving, like nobody knows who Shubrata Mitra is. Ashok Mehta, like a contemporary legend. किसी को पता ही नहीं है कि अशोक मेहता क्या सोचते लाइटिंग के बारे में, उनकी जिंदगी में क्या हुआ था, पार्टीशन में वो इधर आए फिर क्या हुआ. Like, we have no history in India of archiving our greats. And who's to say that the Ramsays are not greats? And who's to say that their work is not amazing? Because you have like distribution houses in Canada, from Canada all the way to Romania and Japan. You have archived the work of the Ramsays, and so why is this legacy sort of like not preserved? And who is in charge of preserving it? So these are the larger questions of the film. I think like what essentially happened was that film buffs such as yourself sort of like really took to it. School of Arts and Aesthetics sort of like they reached out to us and said, we need to show this to our current batch, because it is so in line with each over here, and we need to see like these contemporaries talk about the Ramsays.
I mean, we've had a dissertation come out of the SAR, right, on the Ramsays. Kartik Nair, he's done like hundreds of pages on the Ramsays.
Bootstrapped budget sort of like pushed us to think, how do we put this thing together? We had these bunch of interviews, fascinating conversations, really. And we said, why don't we put it together, which is not our usual style, but as a talking head film, like harking back to the 80s and the 90s documentaries we all grew up watching. And because of what the content that was coming back to the viewer was so full of revelation stories, anecdotes, and just getting these people, Ajay Agrawal or Aarti Surendra,
Somebody lives.
somebody himself
Yeah.
on screen. We knew that it was engaging content, and then to sort of, as to reflect also
Mm.
symbolism to the Ramsay universe itself, we sort of like made sure that there was this music video kind of feel to some of the footage. We
Yeah.
our footage with theirs, and to create a short piece that is still tip of the iceberg. That's a project that we would actually love to go deeper into, talk about, and all of our indie work is also extremely political, as you said. Choose to
Yeah.
talk about the Commonwealth Games and who's kept out of this whole edifice of development is our response,
Mm.
is our anger towards the way the state was putting together a sports extravaganza. Who are you?
Yeah.
Who are at the margins of citizenship? Who can be heard? Who can be seen? Who is invisibilized structurally? These are things that not consciously,
Yeah.
one is
Yeah. Yeah.
constantly dealing with that. So even in this, the real star system that exists within Bollywood, where you're an
Yeah.
A-lister or a C-lister, and if you've acted in a Ramsay film, then you can't be in a Yashraj film, and how these dynamics actually inform the cultural production of an entire
Yeah.
nation. So these are questions we are asking in the film, and so far, whoever's seen it
Mm.
has responded with so much love. It's already being used as educational material in universities globally. So we know that the film has a life beyond festival
Yeah.
or the couple of public exhibitions that it's had, and that's great fun, because then the film has a life beyond us.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's also interesting, to think about, documentary film also, of course, has always been part of pedagogical apparatus, teaching material.
Hmm.
And to have a film like Kings of Horror, be within that canon is, I'm sure it must be very gratifying. Because it's also an unusual film to be, included in such a manner. But I think that that's true also, like this, the genealogy of independent filmmakers in India, like as we saw in the film, connected to the Ramsays, who were sort of one of the early independent film practitioners, in a sense, or a certain an older generation of independent film practitioners outside of the Bollywood firmament. Within the complex of industrial Hindi cinema, they'd set up a cottage industry of sorts that didn't quite operate at the scale of the big studios, but was making as much or more money than they were in the 80s. Rishi Majumdar wrote an essay about the Ramsays. I think it was called Ramsays International. Apparently, Tulsi Ramsay called his sort of these home productions, tiffin box productions. There was something bittersweet as well about like seeing all of these faces as they morphed from the original footage to the present day, older, wizened kind of, real people who played those figures. So there's a lot of that. And I think that what Rintu said also about, the it being political, choosing to work with an archive of schlock. I mean, that's political, right? So yeah, but I also thought like, when I was watching Kings of Horror, it sort of struck me as well that that poignant aspect of seeing these faces and this kind of flinty nostalgia. We spoke about your influences internationally, and you cited Werner Herzog and the new Iranian cinema of the 1990s among your influences. And I remember thinking that going back to those the talking heads of these actors, there's a kind of stoic humanism at the heart of both Herzog's work and the Iranian cinema of the 90s, Kiarostami and Panahi and all of these people. Even with Writing with Fire, the little that I've managed to glimpse online, there's a sense of being up against the odds, which can be a very triumphalist sort of narrative, but also a starkness to their limits. And this humanist kind of ethos, do you want to just expand on that bit?
And I don't think we wanted to make heroes out of anybody, heroes or heroines. Like any of the films that, I mean, in sense, in Timbuktu, Bablu Ganguly holds the narrative together. But I mean, He's just another farmer amongst the many hundreds he's working with. So that's something that we were sort of like fairly
I think
conscious about. And
I think we were talking to a couple of fellow filmmakers sometime last year, and just like jamming on what are you working on, ideas, etc. And we were talking about a couple of films that we have done or are in the works. And one of the things that this filmmaker, she said, I realized that you guys place your stories a lot in outliers or disruptors, and is that a conscious choice? And that's when we were like, wow, that's someone else reflecting on your
Yeah.
work, which you're consciously doing, but people who are constantly, by the nature of how hierarchy works in society, in families, everywhere, like, or on the margins, so to speak. And then from there, sort of like, pushing their way in, creating an alternative vision for a future, finding their own voice.
Mm.
And these are people that we get naturally attracted to. Could be a farmer, could be the Ramsay, could be the construction worker who's building a giant MNC complex that has nothing to do with it. Like him, the day he gets off the tallest lift, or if it's the journalists in Khabar Lahariya, it's really people who are not going to take status quo on the face of it. And our job is really to, through the visual medium, find the unique language for each story to really, engage. That's our voice. My art is my voice. That's my comment. That's my conversation when I'm entering a room.
Yeah.
And you as an audience can agree, engage, disagree, but that's what I'm bringing to the conversation. And so that, I think that's why one does this job and is fascinated by it day in, day out, because of this leap of faith one is taking with the characters, and this relationship of trust. And therefore it's not a conscious effort to humanize it. That's the natural style. That's what attracts us to stories. That's what stories have done to us.
Yeah.
And so again, this, when we are articulating it to you or to that other filmmaker, we're able to
Mm.
intellectualize it and put in, like, try to like, I'm sounding like there's a system to it, but it's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
intuitive.
Mm.
It's a story that we've read on the internet, in the magazine, or a photo story that we saw on the internet. That's how we got to know about Khabar Lahariya's work. So it's a small trigger, and then this is the story you want to tell.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, to me, it did seem like that when you spoke about, the films that the filmmakers whose work has sort of, affected your own practice. I mean, I'm sure you'll respond, but just that when I think about a film like Grizzly Man, Herzog's documentary, I mean, or like, or Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is political, like everything is, but it's not explicitly wearing its politics on its sleeves, or Into the Abyss, which is absolutely wearing its politics on its sleeve. I mean, this kind of, these close-ups, these of faces, the lingering shots, and the compositions of arrangements between human nature, the world, and the human subject against this kind of complicated tapestry, whether it's the wild, whether it's the justice system, whether it's, ancestral heritage. I'm just thinking that maybe that is an approach that, you articulate in some sense when you talk about the way that you take the camera to these locations and to these people. For instance, in the lives of these journalists from Khabar Lahariya or the Ramsay brothers, you only get a glimpse. There's something oblique and there's something that's off screen, right? And there's only so much that you can accompany them, but you're trying to capture that on camera. So what kind of relationship can you forge as an outsider who's approaching with empathy? So that, I think, those things are really what kind of make, for instance, the work of these people that we were discussing humanistic. Sushmit, do you want to say anything? You've been unusually quiet.
it's such a hard question to respond to, because after our last call also I was just like, having a chat with Rintu about like kya influences hai.
Mm.
And it's just such a massive range. I mean, and
Yeah.
we talking about our own personal history. So storytelling is something that had been lying around in my family forever. Like, I mean, I'm a grandchild of, like, my grandparents on either side came into India as refugees. And so our family, so always, there's always been sort of like this hidden trauma. No one talked about it. They would talk about it, in bits and pieces. Now they're in their 90s. We don't want to broach these stories, but they come out like in these moments. Grandmother used to sort of like, as when I was a kid, she used to read out Abul Tabul Shukumar Ray's stories and Mahashweta Devi stories. What a range! Like, from Lim to all the way to sort of somebody like Mahashweta Devi. And then in college, I discovered Manto through Shafi, who's a sort of like a batchmate of ours. And so our lane in college in NCRC had been renamed Sadat Hasan Manto Lane. So one day I was walking with Shafi, I was like, "Ye Manto kaun hai yaar?" And he was like, "Tum Manto ko nahi jante?" And Shafi was an Urdu scholar. I was like, "No, I don't." And that was like, I mean, and the joy of like MCRC was
Like, as
like,
a North Indian, it's like, how dare, right?
yeah, I mean, it was my level of, I was in my own echo chamber, like such ignorance. He Manto ko nahi jante. So, and Shafi had sort of like, he'd studied Urdu, so obviously, I mean, and the joy of being in Jamia was all 45 of us came from very different sort of like, it was a huge socioeconomic range that represented like India. So Shafi was like, "Chalo mere saath." So he took me to the Jamia library and he pulled out Manto's short stories, issued the books, and he was like, "I will read Manto to you in Urdu." And I was like, "मुझे उर्दू समझ में नहीं आती, ये तो बहुत ठेठ है, मैं अंग्रेजी में पढ़ लूंगा." And he was like, "अंग्रेजी में ना ट्रांसलेशन हो चुका है, so उसका मजा नहीं आएगा, मैं पढ़ता हूँ और हर लाइन मैं तुम्हें समझा दूंगा फिर." And that sort of, that 1 week where he read out Manto's short stories to me, we used to sit in this old studio garden after college was over, and he would read these stories out to me, had such a profound impact on me, because I was just like, that is storytelling, where in one paragraph you can really sort of assault all my senses and suck my soul out and then stuff it back in again and make me feel invigorated. How can you do that with words in half a page? Like, that's amazing. I don't know how to sort of like
Yeah.
influences, because it's all over.
No,
And
for sure. Yeah.
yeah, it's always a question that I get a bit stumped to respond to,
Yeah.
because when people, what have been your influences, and I'm just like, I don't know who to pick, because I love David Fincher as well, but
Yeah.
but David Fincher एक जगह, Zhang Yimou एक जगह, और फिर कैसे इस range को हम
But
contain
मेरे
करें.
साथ तो और भी worse है. I had not seen a single documentary in my life till I reached the doors of MCRC. और पहले दिन when they were like, just introductions and what would you like to be, and people said, oh, I'd like, few people said, these are the kinds of films that I've watched and I want to be a documentary filmmaker. And I remember thinking, documentary filmmaker कौन बनना चाहता है? Like, what is the viability of
Famous last words.
yeah, I did it in my head, and look where life takes you. But so in terms of just like my own understanding of cinema was very basic. I'd grown up on like 80s 90s ka cable television watching Bollywood from the 90s, which is by far like the worst that Bollywood produced.
That's true. This is accurate. Yeah.
And so I
She
guess
will sing you all the 90s songs.
Listen, we need to get on a separate call for this.
I'm
And a therapy will be involved for all of us, because I think we are
my car when we are out on shoots, no one wants to be in the car with me because I'm constantly playing these.
Listen, I'm with you. We need to start a club. It's like we're all dealing with the PTSD of the 90s cultural assault on our collective senses. But I totally get that. I mean, and also like, you mentioned Manto again, somebody, he's again a, sort of humanist writer. And I don't think that it's always easy to kind of what you guys said, no? Like map these influences in that way directly. Like, that's not a thing that happens for any artistic practitioner. And it's also, by the way, Sushmit, a great advertisement for public universities. Look where this takes you. Yeah, Jamia being this kind of really diverse place with people of different backgrounds. We need that. And you talked about how different your influences were. I'm very interested in this kind of collective filmmaking that your practice is constituted by virtue of you being two people who are collaborating constantly and being a unit. India has had a long tradition of collective documentary practice, but I want to know from you the logistics and sort of practicalities of working together, whether it's sound, whether it's camera work, how do you come to cinematographic decisions, how do you make those sound decisions, especially because you guys are the kind of documentaries you make, you're shooting in on location, and developing relationships, that's a whole other part of documentary practice that's off camera. So how do you sort of ये जुगलबंदी कैसे होती है?
I think first and foremost is curating the team. कौन है, what is the sensibility that you want on that team for that particular project? And we are really like ants when it comes to planning our shoots. So there's a whole process before which you reach production. So doing our research, just jotting down the story on paper, and it's all projections. These are things that you would estimate, but we've never landed up with a camera on any location not knowing what to do. So we spend a lot of time during pre-production, and we kind of handpick the team that we want to work with, from the DPs to the editor to the person's going to do the music. So that's the real jugalbandi, where everyone is on the same page of kya karne wale hain, and what are their influences, what kind of references are we looking at, ab tak kya kiya hai, and how do we want to change that. So that's a big conversation always.
Do you have new people working with you for different films, or do you have like your
A
cohort?
big pool now of people that we have been constantly working on. It keeps increasing. We are very excited about working with new people. So till I think the pandemic hit us, there were people constantly interning with us, and our first interns are now writers and DPs and directors. So it's a big family, and from that pool we constantly try to match make different projects and see. It's really about who's going to get that lens, and understands the story as intuitively as we do. And when the actual filming is happening, it's really a choreography of what we know and what's coming towards us as a surprise. And between Sushmit and me, we've realized now that he's sort of like the big picture person, the larger details, that, and I'm the finer details, like the smaller nitty gritties person, and that works really well as a combination.
Mm.
And we have our good days, very good days, bad days, terrible days, but it's all, and people who work with us have now understood that symphony.
I think it's fun for them because, you switch off at the end of the day when you finished your shoot. But like for us, we just like also married couple. So
Mm.
into another gear. So yeah, it's fun. It's not easy, but I don't think we would have it any other way because I think what I think the most important thing that went on to us sort of starting work together and incubating the idea of black ticket films was that we might have very different ways and approaches to telling stories, and our styles of directing are very different. But philosophically, we're sort of aligned with what we want to do with the medium of storytelling, and 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 whether that be nonfiction and now potentially fiction as well. A couple of ideas that we're working on. We just know where we want to go with it, and I think that's so important. So, like what your larger vision is, and what is it that you're trying to do as an artist, especially in the context of a place like India, where your art can have many ramifications
Yeah, yeah.
in the times we're in now. So yeah.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, it's, to me, it's interesting how people who are sort of working together as a unit have to kind of develop this coordination and just this kind of also logistical and practical chemistry. That I think, and filmmaking is such an intensive, resource intensive job. Final question, and I think this is a broad one, but an important one. Now, this film that you've done, writing with fire, is sort of based within the news media sphere, and it struck me that, so this is just a casual taxonomy, but with nonfiction film, you have a few broad strands that have emerged in India. not in terms of genres, but in terms of sites of consumption, let's say. So you have the classic sort of news media documentary, which these days is also a vehicle for government propaganda because we no longer have a free press. The independent social or political documentary, whether state funded or privately produced, that in India historically found its viewers via public screenings at universities or cultural centers or even maybe localities. And that's now migrated online, perhaps, in some cases. Then there is the contemporary art nonfiction work, which is installed in white cube or black cube spaces. And one might expand the sort of post cinematic horizon to include native internet formats like TikTok, for example, which is a largely subaltern media form. So, how do you think of these various strands of nonfiction film as practitioners? Maybe a slightly dense question, but I think your answer is important.
मुझे तो बहुत अच्छा लगता है that I mean you have so many different ways of sort of like expressing now, and not less to do with technology, because I think that the internet has also changed the way we're telling our stories and consuming
Yeah.
our stories. So as Bresson I think once said, I'd rather people feel a film than understand it, because feelings arise before intellect. So even a photograph is a story. And I remember like Alex Maioli, who is an Italian photographer with Magnum, and his work had a profound impact on me. Now it's like ऐसे ही shoot करना है, black and white में ऐसे ही काम करेंगे हम, कर ही नहीं पाए, हमारी बस की नहीं थी. So but like I mean anything sort of like that can spark your imagination, that can get you to think, whether that be a micro story, whether that be a podcast. I just think it's fantastic that more and more people are getting to tell their stories, and that is what is so beautiful.
I think it's about agency. It's really about agency and voice. And now, what oft repeated we're saying, who gets to tell my story, and in what way? The hegemony of the narratorial voice is changing. It doesn't rest with one person with who has access to resources, and everything else that needs you to put together an apparatus of storytelling. It's become delinked to the larger organism, and every moving part is active with possibilities, and that is a very very joyous time actually to be in. And harking back to your first question of who's actually supporting this kind of work, and in many ways, filmmakers, storytellers in South Asia actually are organisms on their own right and might, and we've figured it. We're telling it on our own. We've not had resources, but we're not wallowing in that depth. And it's not a fair system even there. It's more aged and matured than our systems here, and it takes a while to figure that out as well. But at it, we're also and a lot of us are also doing that on our own terms, and that's liberating. And to watch TikTok is liberating. So I think in terms of cultural production of visual material, we're in a very very dynamic time, and to be out there with a camera right now is a very exciting time, because now people are more aware. People are now asking us, ये Netflix के लिए बन रही है film. गाँव में जाओगे आप, the first thing we want to ask is drone कब निकालोगे? Completely changed.
The kids are on it for sure. Yeah.
Completely. We were shooting in Uttarakhand, and all the women, the farmers, the women were just like, drone se aap ye shot nahi lenge, pahad ke upar se. And that was from 10 years back, where we had to explain everything and what we're trying to do, la la la.
Yeah.
So all of it is actually a very dynamic time to be producing these stories.
Yeah, and I think to circle back to our initial sort of discussion about who gets to tell these stories as well. I mean, some of the agitprop that has been coming out on TikTok, these kids doing incredible political work as well on these short micro fiction kind of platforms. I mean, they never. The idea is the goal isn't to end up in some major festival, but with the technology and the digital medium being in the hands of young people of across strata, that is it's unprecedented in history, I think, to have that much control over your voice and how you put things out and how you represent yourself and express yourself. So that's truly something that we need to kind of track closely. That's also why the governments across the world keep trying to ban all of these platforms and apps, right? Because they are a threat. I mean, yeah, there's penetration, there's possibility, there's something happening. But thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to Artalap. It was great having you.
Thank you so much for having us.
I
It was a
think
pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours. And I do want to close the DD Urdu story. We didn't get the project that year. And
Spoiler
it
alert.
was traumatizing. And after 3 years, we get a letter by post. After we won the national award, we got a letter by post saying, "Oh, you've been shortlisted. And we'll give you 4 lakh rupees to do 7 episodes." We were like, "That's
4 seems to be this terrible number that chased us
stuck
for
to
a
us.
long time.
There's something to that.
Yeah, so thank it is. And so I think it's been a wonderful opportunity to also recap our own journey
Yeah.
and
And
work.
name names, PSBT and DD. Yeah, I mean, I guess you guys are like immune from any backlash now. तो you आप तो बन गए, तो अब तो ठीक है, अभी नाम ले सकते हैं.
Also, they've been supporting functions for so many filmmakers, especially I feel that I mean, one of the critiques that a lot of filmmakers, including us, have had is that why can't you increase the grants and reduce the number of filmmakers? But then the response to that always has been, but then lesser filmmakers, lesser first-time filmmakers, lesser student filmmakers get an opportunity, and that makes sense. So it's bootstrapped, but it is what it is, and you've got to sort of live with that. And I think the times that we are in now, more and more people are finding newer ways of telling their stories. So while there are no avenues, there are many avenues, and that's the irony of it all. And that is what makes it so exciting to be a storyteller in today's day. So
Right.
yeah,
That you're right. Paradox, but a promising one. Let's see how it plays out. Thank you so much once again for being on Artalap.
thank you.
And all the best with all your future projects. I hope we have a chance to speak in depth, maybe once Writing with Fire gets a wider release in India. Thank you for tuning in to Artalap with Rintu Thomas and Sushmit Ghosh, in which we discuss their award-winning filmmaking practice in the wake of their multiple wins at the Sundance Film Festival 2021. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alap and on Twitter at @RTALAAP. Before I go, I want to take a moment to send strength and support to our listeners as we in India battle the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you and those you care about stay safe during this time. A reminder too that direct messages on Artalap's social media, Instagram and Twitter are open if you want to share resources, especially if you're an arts and culture organization wanting to spread information about relief initiatives.